Good morning. I'm Alex Sheppard, CEO of LIG Biowise, and we are a molecular diagnostics company based out of Manchester Science Park in the UK. And our focus is on driving advanced molecular technologies out of hospitals and into the community to transform the way in which we diagnose and treat infectious diseases. There's obviously been a very significant move towards decentralized testing with molecular techniques of testing for infectious diseases, so a lot of core challenges from the technology side are delaying the advancement of molecular techniques into community settings. So our vision would be that syndromic testing rather than single target or dual target testing for infectious diseases could be carried out in even a pharmacy or GP setting to improve the equitable offering of healthcare towards the community angle. So in terms of where we are at the moment, so we're a pre-revenue company in the development phase on point-of-care diagnostic technology that would be ultra-rapid in its nature. Our core IP is centered around unique isothermal amplification-based molecular primer sets that allow us to identify relevant pathogens much faster than the current gold standard, whether that be classic PCR testing or with new methods under the isothermal amplification umbrella. What we've done so far towards achieving these goals is we've raised 1.8 million in private finance through a VC and 330,000 in grant funding awards from Innovate UK and NHS projects. This has allowed us to build up a core asset base around deep medtech industry experience on our board and a highly experienced set of molecular scientists, the filing of 2 patents in the UK with the PCT phase pending next year, with a few more to follow. And further to that, this has also allowed us to carry out early-stage clinical studies on our primer sets that we have so far in the UK and in primary care environments. And this has then taken us to the position where in our lab presently we do have a concept demonstration prototype device that we are using to starting to test against these primer sets with an initial focus on upper respiratory tract infections, which I'll come on to in a moment. Now, in order to achieve our goal of advancing diagnostics in the way that we want, we're currently raising a £5 million funding round in 2 tranches of £2.5 million on milestone achievements, particularly in sort of next winter 2019's clinical studies that we're planning. We've already identified a cornerstone investor that would contribute 40% of the total £5 million round, so 1 in each tranche. And our current investor, who's based in China, is also interested in contributing to this round as well. And so we would be interested in syndicating around these 2 main investors. In terms of the first key milestone for us is at the end of next year, we would have 3 identical clinical prototypes with which to carry out clinical studies on 200 patient samples, thereby giving us really accurate data points against the sensitivity, specificity, and speed of our device. Beyond these 2, this equity round, we would seek to raise the final £6 million cash requirement at that stage, non-dilutively through commercial deals, because at this stage we would just be on the cusp of regulatory approvals in the US, so we would seek debt or commercial-based deals to finance our development and regulatory approvals at that stage, likely through executing our commercial strategy for China. Now, what really is the problem with diagnostics in the community? Why do diagnostics have to get closer to the patient? So largely in the community setting, we are still quite reliant on empirical techniques to diagnose and therefore treat patients that are coming into, whether that's the emergency room or doctor's office environment, if we think about the US. And so this leads to a number of complications, limiting our response to AMR if we're thinking about the rise of drug resistance in a number of infectious disease areas, whether that is about inappropriate treatments in primary care, risking unnecessary escalations or unnecessary prescribing. So if we think that, say, in the UK and the US, unnecessary prescribing of antibiotics in the community can be as high as 50 or even 60% for a lot of disease areas, this can create a lot of healthcare costs and poorer patient outcomes. Secondly, we really want to improve the accuracy accuracy of our short-term patient strategy, not thinking about how you will deal with a patient over a couple of weeks with a respiratory infection, but really a couple of days, because these are the timescales around which we work in that infectious disease area. And why do we think that we are going to be positioned well to look at the burgeoning community-based diagnostic offering, where through the creation of waypoints in the community, whether they be old people's homes or whether they are pharmacies or areas like this, we could deploy tests for infectious disease in these areas that are sufficiently rapid. So what we have in terms of our technology are rapid primer sets to cover a syndromic test panel. So somebody could come in with an acute cough, and you're able to test for sufficient pathogens to cover most of the potential outcomes of that test. Second to that, there's also the capability within the company to develop any primer sets for any infectious disease area very rapidly indeed, based on the IP and core competency of the company. So, for example, while our initial focus is on upper respiratory tract, there's enormous potential to look at testing in UTI, for example, where there is significantly increased resistance in bacteria in that area. And here's a bit of the data that we've initially taken from pathogens that we're currently testing against. And so our current average against, for example, here we have some bacterial primer sets. The average time from sample to result is around 13 minutes, which is actually significantly faster than the average against even this is isothermal amplification against isothermal amplification compared here, significantly faster than an average of between 20 and 25 minutes testing there, which is actually really significant. If we think that actually most PCR testing needs at least an hour typically to run, has to be run in a lab and requires sample preparation. If we're able to look at primer sets that in themselves are, say, 10 minutes faster, you're already looking at really directly applying this technology to an environment where you've got to come in under 30 minutes and you've got to cost less than $50, which is the core market requirement to access the community setting, particularly in the US. And what opportunities does this create? So naturally, this opens us up to look at existing point-of-care devices in the field and whether our primer sets could be deployed in these existing point-of-care testing technologies. And this is something that we're doing at the moment, approaching strategics to see what their interest levels are in working with us on our primer sets to deploy in existing point-of-care devices that may already be in the field, or whether that is looking at interest in the sense of a manufacturing license or co-development, where we would develop a community-targeted device with fully automated sample preparation and microfluidic pathways that are tailored for a very, very fast test alongside the primers, and taking it in that direction. That being said, our in-house objectives in terms of what we have to do to prove this competency remain the same, whether we partner with a strategic or whether we look at purely a distribution model when it comes to commercialization of a test like this. And why do we think we're able to do that? Well, we do have a highly skilled team, as I mentioned, with really deep medtech industry experience on our board. For example, with mine hired working for Roche for a very, very long time, and also Simon in terms of fundraising in the medtech space. And further to that, we also already have some KOLs on board with us in the form of both primary care and respiratory experts in the diagnostics space, which give us the platform then to look at deploying this technology in a community environment. And the first case study, as I mentioned, our initial focus is on upper respiratory tract flu season diagnostics in the US. And there's a really big reason for this. In the developed world, this is by far the most advanced and developed pathway for community testing globally, I would say, and certainly the one in which the reimbursement, regulatory pathways and workflows are very well established, which massively de-risk the proposition of deploying a molecular test, almost certainly for the first time in terms of its complexity, into a primary care environment. Now, in the US, again, in upper respiratory tract, there are 44 million patients who visit their doctor or go to the emergency room with the symptoms of acute cough every year. And currently, 80 to 100% of them are swab tested. And this is largely because, again, in the CDC, there is enormous incentivization programs around discovering and then treating influenza when it occurs to then feed through disease trends to their inoculation programs going forwards. But what this means is there is already a testing setup, not only in doctors' offices, but also in emergency rooms to seek out largely influenza. And so largely these are immunoassay technologies which are not particularly accurate and only dual target. So the opportunity here is to deploy a low-cost test in this environment where your costing against your test is in the same ballpark as the cost to run an immunoassay test. But actually, this is something that is a syndromic panel, because the question that primary care clinicians in the US really want to answer in upper respiratory tract is it a virus or not? This is actionable clinical data. Finding out if you have influenza A or not is largely useless in terms of how you're then going to treat that patient if you get a negative result. And you, of course, in a service-based healthcare model, you have to contend with drug-seeking behaviors and sort of an increasingly knowledgeable patient body. So there is a significant opportunity to extract value here, and which we estimate at around $1.3 billion for this segment alone. With what kind of product? So it has to be, of course, a vision for a community-targeted device. The current devices out there that are broad syndromic testing devices require lab and sample preparation in order to be deployed effectively. This has to be something that's simple enough for a pharmacist to use, a practice nurse to use, that requires no sample preparation and is fully automated. Further coupled with our advanced primers, which are significantly faster than existing molecular primers as to the gold standard in industry as things stand. And we have an attractive proposition for something that could be deployed in the community. And our initial focus, while being in upper respiratory tract, this device could be applied to other disease areas, so other panels covering, say, UTI or lower respiratory tract panels as we move forwards. And currently it's our aim to focus on the FDA 510K regime, where there is a precedent existing for a device like this, because we're not introducing completely new issues of safety or efficacy, and this gives an opportunity for us to leverage that in a way that makes sense, and also to look at the fact that there are already pre-existing CPT codes against the panel that we have in mind. And what kind of test would this have to be? And so enabled through our primer technology, we could be looking at testing for, say, 15 pathogens in 20-25 minutes, with results then being, say, even sent by text to the patient after they've left it, or running a waiting room protocol with what would be essentially a smart device. So imagine being able to go to your local pharmacy with a cough, and then 20 minutes later, after you've been swab tested, you're receiving a text message to say, you have RSV, it's just a cold, don't worry about it. And just the amount of patient satisfaction from that, and when we've seen tests like this deployed in studies in the US so far, even just with influenza testing, customer and patient satisfaction goes through the roof when they actually have test data, because incidentally, patients seem to trust tests a lot more than doctors do. And in terms of the protocol, because we're using a molecular base for this test, the accuracy, the sensitivity, and specificity are very, very high, potentially above even 98%. So this is a really reliable test that is very simple to run, simply taking a swab, inserting it into a cartridge, and once that cartridge is put into the device and it starts running, it's fully automated and you don't need to touch it. And this is what's really required to capture this community opportunity where you don't have highly skilled lab operators. And the competition, so largely the competition is split between broad syndromic-based tests that are deployed in hospitals and single or dual target, largely, if we look at upper respiratory, influenza-based tests that can be deployed in the community. And now, obviously, largely these tests in the community are often immunoassays, and if they're not, they're only testing for a couple of pathogens, which makes their clinical value a lot lower than the large-scale syndromic testing that's carried out. However, these tests are very expensive. So reimbursement pathways in the US currently set these at $43 per pathogen. If we think about the sort of BioFire test, which is one of the trailblazers in this area, it costs about $120 to get tested, which is way out of reach for the community setting, which is most critical to opening up a new segment in the point-of-care diagnostics market. Now, the company, as I mentioned, will seek a pre-commercial exit following key regulatory approvals, and it's our focus at the moment to look at the FDA, while, of course, we are open to partnership, whether that be co-development in terms of working with existing devices in the field, or sponsor development where we can actually introduce a brand new community point-of-care focused device. And in terms of the way that would work, it would work on a razor blade model with a national distributor, for example, in the US, where people are only paying against the cartridges and test cartridges that they buy in. There are existing reimbursement CPT codes and payer buy-in for tests of this nature, but they just simply aren't deployed in the community as things stand. With China, we would seek commercial partnership in that phase, so it's likely that after this initial round that we're currently raising is carried out, we would seek non-dilutive commercial funding to support that. And this is a quick final summary of where we currently are at and what we're looking to carry out. So we've currently got a prototype in-house. We're running some tests on that this winter. In order to get to the phase where we've got 3 clinical prototypes that we can run comprehensive clinical studies on to get our full test data against the initial panel we're targeted on and prove our competency, this requires the initial tranche of $2.5 million that that we're looking to raise, or our total £5 million round to achieve that. And once we have got a design frozen product that is ready for FDA approval, we would then seek a non-dilutive funding round in order to support that work through a commercial partnership, either funded through licensing opportunity in China once we have the device itself, or through looking at other markets that could be of interest to us.